Christian cultural leadership. On Thursdays, you have a course called CCL, Christian Cultural Leadership, but we haven't yet actually explored what that means, what kind of an animal this is. And so this session is going to explore that a little bit more. Briefly, the plot of this session, before we can talk about what is Christian cultural leadership, there's a big word in there. Well, it's actually three big words, right? But we also haven't really discussed yet what is culture. So in order to answer what is Christian cultural leadership, I think we first have to engage a little bit with the concept of culture. So basically, we're going to go, what's culture, why bother with it, and then what's CCL, and why bother with it. That's the plot. So to start with, what is culture? Let me ask you 2 or 3 questions. So the first question would be basically give a word association for culture. What words come to mind when you hear the word culture? So if you need to pause the recording at this point, give yourself a moment, think of some words that come to mind when you hear the word culture. Also give some feeling words as well. How do you feel about culture? And then one thing to look at is if you look at some of your answers, were your words positive or were they negative? Were they neutral? Were they a mix? So just have a brief look at your answers and evaluate them in that light. And we'll get back to that one in a while. Let me ask you the next question. If you had to give a definition of culture, just one sentence, what would it be? Again, just take a moment and try and give a definition of culture. What does culture mean? What does the word mean? What does the concept mean? And also give 3 examples of culture. So I don't want to say a little bit more, but just, give 3 examples of what you mean with culture. 3 ways in which culture shows itself. 3 ways in which culture shows up. 3 different areas in which we would say, well, that's us doing culture, that is cultural. Now, just some answers of previous years would have been something like this. Food or music or the clothes that we wear or, of course, our language. All these are good answers, by the way. Then there's also, I suppose, answers in the realm of customs or rituals, traditions, practices, festivals. But I'm kind of hoping that in your examples, you also saw that culture actually reaches further than that. So yes, it reaches some of the things that we see on the surface, but it also includes or is certainly related to our beliefs, what we believe about reality, our values, the ideas that we have. We did some sessions on worldviews in term 1, if you remember. Culture is also about the worldviews that we have. So I think the important thing here is just to see perhaps culture is a bigger thing than we might have thought at first glance. Let me then get back to that middle question, the question of a definition of culture. So all of this is in your handout as well, but just some definitions. I think I went a little bit wild here with all the definitions, but that's okay. We don't have to read them all now. But if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, this is what it says. Let me just highlight 1 or 2 specific things here. So if you just have a look at that number 3, it says the customs and institutions and achievements of a particular nation, people, or group. But also have a look at number 4, the cultivation of plants, breeding of animals, or production of cells or tissue. So there's also almost like the culture in a biological sense, that in the lab you can create or cultivate a culture of cells or bacteria. So there's that sense of growing, that sense of cultivation in the Latin origin of the word culture. Going across the Atlantic to an American dictionary, again, just to point out one or two things. If you have a look at the first one, the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns and arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought. You can see that as a very broad, very wide-ranging, very comprehensive definition of culture. But then notice also the second point, there's also a more specific definition. It's talking about these patterns and traits and products considered as the expression of a particular period or class or community or population. So we would talk about the culture at a particular workplace or in a particular, setting, in a particular, classroom at school even perhaps. Okay, so there are, there's almost like there's culture in the broad sense and also culture in the more narrow, specific sense. And it's important, I think, to keep both of those in mind. Let me move on. Tim Keller again. I'm going to read this one because it is a very, very good one, I think. A society's culture is a set of shared practices and attitudes and values and beliefs. And I would add stories, which are rooted in common understandings of the big questions: where life comes from, what life means, who we are, no one can live without some assumed answers to such questions. And every set of answers shapes culture, the way we treat the material world, the way we relate the individual to the group and family, the way groups and classes relate to each other, the way we handle sex, money, and power, the way we make decisions and set priorities, and the way we regard death, time, art, government, and physical space. You can see again, he's giving a very comprehensive definition of culture. Culture is kind of everywhere. Then also, I suppose you can read this one in your own time if you want. Dennis Hollinger talks again about, if I just highlight the yellow bits, if you are looking at the video version, outlooks, beliefs, attitudes, feelings, actions. He talks of culture as a kind of mental map that we have, and that impacts our perspectives and ways of being and pattern of doing. And then I really like these last three. Human culture is the sum of what humans produce and of the ways in which they are organized for life together. And 1.6, culture is the signature of human existence. I really like that. You know, the idea of a signature. Each one of us has a unique signature. And in a way, culture is our human signature. Or also the last one, I think, really love that one. Culture is what we make of creation. So God gives us his creation, and culture is then what we do with that. So, just to ask some questions, and I'm going to relate these questions to God's story, which I think in the meantime you're very familiar with, but just some important introductory questions to ask about this culture thing. So one question I would ask you is culture the result of the fall? Now, this is also one of those places where now I really miss not being able to be face to face with you, because this would be a really interactive bit. We would discuss this a lot. We would kick around some ideas. We would see to what extent we're on the same page on this. So unfortunately, at the moment, you just have to listen to me. So is culture the result of the fall? Think about that for a moment. Is it sin that brought culture into the world? And I'm very much hoping that your answer is no, because if we look at the creation part of the story, so pre-fall, before sin entered, we certainly have God already giving Adam and Eve a mandate. He's telling them, form and fill the earth, take care of it on my behalf. So he's giving what theologians are actually calling the cultural mandate, right? Basically the mandate to cultivate, to grow, to cultivate the garden, human relationships, the way we structure ourselves, everything we do with creation. So that is called the cultural mandate. Basically, God is saying, go and make culture. Basically, God is saying, look, I've given you creation. This is your starter kit. Now enjoy it and be creative about it and do stuff with it, and form and fill and shape and manage and do your thing. Express yourselves. Be cultural beings. That's in a way what God is saying. So culture is very much something that is not the result of sin. It's part of the creation order. So now let's go to the other side of the story and let me ask you the next question. Will there be culture in heaven? Again, think about that for a moment. What would your answer be? And how would you motivate your answer? Now, again, even if you just think about how the story begins and the fact that the way the story ends, or the new beginning in that last renewal chapter, you wouldn't expect the last chapter to be anything less than what the first chapter was. You wouldn't expect that once God is renewed, that he will have created something less than what he started with. So one would imagine that if the creation order included culture, I would very much imagine that the renewed creation order would also include culture. And we see, again, some glimpses of that, but only glimpses. So if you think of one of the pictures that God uses, or that the Bible uses about the future, about the renewed creation, is that of a wedding feast, a wedding banquet. Now, a wedding is culture, right? Try doing a wedding without any culture, just in terms of the dress code, in terms of the food. Also, one of the pictures, maybe it's just a picture, maybe it's something more firm than a picture, but the idea of the heaven or the New Jerusalem, the garden city, basically the renewed creation as a garden city. So basically the story begins in the garden, it ends in the garden city. Something happened there, right? Human beings made culture, and that was a good thing. It'll be in heaven. Okay? Imagine a city without culture. You can't. Okay? So the moment you build any building, the architecture is some expression of culture. Any food, any music is an expression of culture, the way we're going to do community. So heaven will very much be a cultural place. Okay? And then just to, I suppose, fill in the last bit of the story, the bit we're in now, what does redemption then mean for culture? Okay? So in the beginning, God gave us a cultural mandate. Sin marred that a little bit, and certainly now, that's why culture presently is a little bit of a difficult concept to us. But we know the story is going again to a good place. So what difference does redemption make? Does redemption touch culture? Is redemption concerned with culture in any way? Again, think about that for a moment. And I'm again hoping that your answer will have had something to do with, yes, its redemption has to make some difference to culture as well. So God's renewal project isn't only about picking some souls and transporting them to heaven. I think it's bigger than that. It's as wide as the whole creation is, and it would include some some aspects, some dimensions of culture as well. So, assuming you're reasonably on board with what I've just said, is culture then good or bad? And I think the answer is, well, it is a mix based on that story, all right? We have a mix of creation and fall. There's a mix of dignity and depravity. And there's a mix of culture reflecting God's character, reflecting God's purposes, and then culture marred and damaged and distorted and hijacked in some ways by sin. But then, of course, also we said we're hoping that redemption is gotta, in some ways, have made a difference to culture as well. So we would expect, if the story is true, and if this is the story that we're living in, we would expect culture to be a mix of good and bad things, and it will be a complicated mix. We won't easily be able to separate out the good from the bad either, and that is, I think, that is part of our current challenge, is to deal with this mixed bag thing called culture. That's very mixed up between really good stuff and really not so good stuff. So, if that is true, how would you respond to the following? And again, take yourself a moment on each one. If somebody says, it's cultural, therefore it is ungodly. Or here's actually a similar one. Culture is man-made and not from God. Okay, given where we've been so far, how would you answer that? Now, because culture, as we said, is a mixed bag, is part of the creation order, but also marred by the fall, we cannot just blanket say that culture is ungodly or culture is not from God. Okay? So some of culture will be godly, some of culture will be ungodly. It's a mixed bag. So I can't just wholesale reject culture and say, oh, it's ungodly. I also can't reject it as man-made and not from God, because remember, it's God who actually gives the mandate to make culture. So yes, it's, in a sense, it's man-made, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, right? Because we also are mixed bag people. Okay, we are made in God's image, creation order, and we are fallen creatures. We are sinful, and so we too are these mixed bag creatures. So if something is man-made, that we can't yet say whether it's good or bad. It's probably a mix of both. And so as we make culture, we probably have a mix of both. How would you respond to somebody who says, it's my culture, don't touch it, okay? Don't criticize it, leave it alone? How would you answer that? So here too, I think this is almost like the other extreme. This is someone who wholesale embraces culture, who basically says, because it's culture, it's a good thing, or certainly it's beyond any critique or challenge. Now, again, we got to be careful with that, because I think this person isn't seeing the fall properly. They're seeing the creation order, but not the fall. So it's almost like the inverse of the first two. In the first two, the person saw the fall much more than they saw the creation order. So remember, culture is because it's a mixed thing, we do want to be discerning about that. So it's important to be able to say, this is good, this is bad, or this is godly, this is not godly. This is in line with God's character and purposes, and this is not. It's important to be able to say that. Now, I know what I'm saying here is controversial, okay? So I could get myself into trouble for saying that, but I do believe that is the approach that we should have for culture. How would you answer this one? It's just cultural. It's not a spiritual issue. It's just cultural. So this person is essentially saying culture is neutral. It's It's not something, perhaps not even something important, but certainly it's neutral. And again, from what we've seen so far, we've got to be careful with that, because culture is seldom neutral. Yes, there would be some things like, I don't know, whether you're wearing blue or green in your clothes, that would be fairly neutral. But a lot of culture, and more than we think, is not neutral. So much of culture is an expression of our beliefs, of our value systems, of our worldviews, and those are rarely neutral. So again, it's important that we, just engage more deeply and more intentionally with that. What do you say to the person who says culture is what happens back at home? Okay, so do you get this one? So I don't know, here at the workplace, there's no culture, but then when I go back home, maybe to the village or the rural areas, that's where culture happens. And it's almost like back at home there's this add-on that we do that we don't actually do in the city or at the workplace. What do you answer to that statement? So I think this is a tricky one, because I think to me the important thing though is to realize that culture is everywhere. So I think don't let someone almost like do that to you, that they're basically saying your culture is what you're doing back on your side, but here in the public space, that's the neutral ground. Okay, any public space is also in some ways intertwined with culture, is an expression of culture. Sometimes we like to be blind to culture and we don't see it. Okay, but every place is a place in which culture finds some expression. It's not just something that happens when we do particular rituals or follow particular traditions and practices. Culture is what happens everywhere. So almost like don't let someone push you aside by saying culture is somewhere else there where you come from, but not here where we're standing now, because that person isn't playing fair. They're not seeing that where they are standing and what they are expressing is also culture. And what they're doing is they're almost like, it's not playing fair, because now they're putting their own culture beyond scrutiny. They're trying to make us not see it so that we don't in any way challenge it where it needs to be challenged. Okay, so therefore our role is to engage with discernment. So our role is not to wholesale embrace on the one hand or wholesale reject on the other hand. And so this is an attempt from me just to give some words, and you might find others, some verbs of how we would do this engagement thing. We would discern, decide, speak, act, shape, lead, etc. Remember the Tim Keller video in the contextualization session? He talks about confronting and completing the cultural narrative. Okay, so that's, again, it's a both and, because there are things about culture that need to be confronted, but there are also things about culture that can be affirmed and that can be shown to be completed in the gospel story. So we do both. We do the both and, because culture is a both and, because culture is a mixed bag. Good. So far, so good. So that was an attempt to define culture. Now, I think I've already started to answer the question of why bother with culture. Okay, so given that this is what it is, why do we bother with it? I think we've already started to answer it. So, but by way of answering this question, I want to ask you further questions, again, just to think about for a few moments. First question, what is God the God of? Or what is Jesus the Lord of? So all of these questions are really designed, I'm hoping, to help us think about this culture thing and our role in it. What is God the God of? Is God the God of church things? Or is God the God of all things? Is Jesus the Lord of Christianity, or is Jesus the Lord of the universe? Can you see how this matters? It matters how you answer that question. Because if you answer, well, God is just the God of, I don't know, church stuff, then you are going to function differently in our world than if you understand God to be the God of the universe. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. The Bible speaks of Jesus as Lord over all, not just over some stuff, but over all stuff. Okay? So Jesus is Lord over culture. That means Jesus, or God, is concerned about culture, is excited about culture, wants us to do culture. It's certainly on his radar. It's not something that he considers unimportant. Let's try another question. I suppose these are all questions that are taking us to a similar place. Has God given up on our planet? Has God given up on our nation? So it's another way of saying, is there anything that is outside the scope of God's care and of God's presence as well? Right? If God hasn't given up on our planet or on our nation, neither should we. And so our mission is to engage. Where is Satan working, and where is God working? And so Satan's at work in a lot of places, right? And I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to be able to see that. But do we think that Satan's work is bigger than God's work? Do we think Satan is able to reach areas that God either isn't reaching or has written off or isn't concerned about? Do you see what I'm after here? Surely God's work has got to be, the scope of God's work and God's reach has got to be at least as big as Satan's reach. So even if we notice some things in our cultures that are troubling and problematic, and we will notice those things, but even if we do, we still know that God is bigger, and God is present, and God is active, and God cares about culture. So perhaps expressed as a similar way, what is unredeemable? It's an important question. Think about it a moment. What are the things that are unredeemable? If the scope of creation is all things, and if the future of the Bible story is about the renewal of all things, then surely there are very few things that can be unredeemable. So again, think of the storyline. It can't be that, creation's rather big, and then the fall is rather big because it touches every part of creation, and it really does. Okay, every part of us is marred and affected by sin. But it can't then be surely that then redemption and renewal is smaller than that. Okay? That we have a really big creation, a really big fall, but then suddenly redemption is just a small thing and renewal is a small thing. That just doesn't make sense. So surely the reach of God's redemption and renewal has got to be as wide as creation is. So what is unredeemable? My best answer to that would be sin is unredeemable. But everything else is redeemable. And perhaps a similar question then, what is worldly? Now, worldly is one of those words that I think we need to take a careful look on, because I think we use it wrong in many, many ways. So what is worldly, and what is whatever you think its opposite is? Let's say godly. So think for a moment, what is worldly, what is godly? And by way of seeking to answer that question, let's try an exercise. Now, this is an important exercise. I think if we get this right, it'll be a milestone. It'll be really, really good. So basically what I'm showing you here is a picture, or I don't know, a chart of various aspects of life. Okay, this is meant to show all of life. Now, obviously, there will be other categories that I haven't shown, but I think I'm showing a good number of them, at least to start with. So on that then, what I want you to do, you can do this in your handouts, you can do this in your head as well. But again, if I'm hoping that if you are looking at or just listening to the audio version of this, that you do have your handout in front of you. I want you to draw a line between godly and worldly, or perhaps also presume these words say something similar, a line between spiritual and unspiritual. Okay, so you get it? So draw a line somewhere in this diagram that everything on the one side of the line is godly or spiritual, and everything on the other side of the line is worldly or unspiritual. So have a go at that. If necessary, press pause. Right now, the way that many people draw the line was something like this. I'm not sure which side family goes, perhaps bottom or top, but something like that, that basically everything above the line here would be godly or spiritual, and then everything below would be worldly. Now, I know this is the way that it would frequently be drawn. I want to challenge that. I want to suggest that that is the wrong way to draw the line, that is not the biblical way to draw the line. And what I want to suggest is that the line perhaps goes something like this, that the line goes through all parts of our lives, really. In all of these areas, we could be following God, going in line with God's purposes and character, or we could be going against God and working against his plans. So in other words, in all of these, we can be either spiritual on the one side or unspiritual on the other side. In all of these things, we can be godly and can be worldly. And I'm hoping that that's not too controversial. I know in some things, like, for example, politics, some people might think, oh, but that's such a dirty game. There's hardly anything godly about it. But, I think all of these things are mixed bag things. Okay, all of these things are in some ways expression of who we are. It's an expression of us making culture. And so in all of these things, we would expect mixed bag results. Some things that glorify God, and some things that work against God. And I think it also shouldn't be too controversial to say that even things like in church, that some worldly or unspiritual things, some sin can creep into the church. We know that. I think we're all aware of that. And even into our prayer lives, or into the way we worship. I threw the visions of angels in there just for fun. But where I'm going to with that is, if you have a look at, I think it's Colossians 2, verse 18, Paul actually describes someone who is boasting about his visions of angels. And then Paul says, this guy's unspiritual mind is puffed up. So can you see what's happening there? This guy's having visions of angels. Man, that's got to be like the ultimate spiritual. And yet, Paul then says this guy has an unspiritual mind. Why? Because he's engaging with something of spiritual significance, but he's engaging with it in the wrong way. He's actually being unspiritual. He's actually going against God's purposes rather than towards God. Does that make some sense? So in all of these areas, we could be spiritual. In all of these areas, we could be unspiritual. Unspiritual doesn't mean there is no spiritual dimension. Unspiritual means there's something of spiritual significance happening there, but it's going against God, against who God is, against what God does. That is the way that the Bible uses the word unspiritual. Try that. I mean, these days we can, we have our Bibles on our cell phones and we can word search. So word search for unspiritual, word search for worldly. You'll see that that is the way that the Bible uses the word. So worldly isn't, I don't know, cars and houses and those things. Worldly is our wrong orientation towards things like cars and houses. Does that make some sense? I hope. Let's try another exercise just to firm that up. So here's another one where I'm going to ask you to draw a line. And again, draw that same line. Let me quickly describe what you're seeing. You're seeing a house with two rooms. And in one room, there are people who are praying. So these people on the left here, they are working. Well, they are praying hard. And then on the right hand side, there are people in that room. There are people washing dishes. So again, take your pen on your handout and take a moment and draw the line between godly and worldly. The line between spiritual and unspiritual. Now, I suppose similar to the previous exercise, what people would perhaps frequently do is to do this, because surely prayer is spiritual and washing dishes, well, not really, right? And again, I want to challenge that. I don't think that is the biblical view. What if the line actually goes something like this? And on the one side of the line is godly, on the other side of the line is worldly. Let me try and illustrate. So, for example, this person is the one praying person is really praying their heart out to God, and they're really seeking God's face and really coming to God with the whole of their being in prayer. The other person is using big words and basically showing off with their prayer. They want to show everybody how awesome they are. So they're really, just boasting in a sense with their prayers. Okay? So now the one person is being spiritual, the other one is being unspiritual. The one is godly, the other one is worldly. And then similarly, in the other room, the one person is washing dishes and saying, and gladly doing that as an act of service towards God and neighbor, and saying, this is these dishes have been the result of a great meal of relationship that we could have with each other, and now I'm going to clean them as a way of blessing, as a way of being able to enable the next meal, as a way of also just keeping us all healthy and not getting sick. And so this person is rejoicing in what they are doing. Whereas the other person over here is perhaps, grumbling, and why do I always have to wash the dishes, and I hate this. And okay, so again, one of the people is being spiritual, the other one is unspiritual. One of them is godly, the other one is worldly. And then thirdly, let's try this diagram. So basically, draw the same line, the line between godly and worldly, or spiritual and unspiritual. Give you a moment. Common way to draw the line, perhaps, would be right in the middle between God and human. Again, that's a worldview that sometimes is expressed in church circles. So basically, God good, human bad. right? And we use the word human to express bad, sinful, broken, whatever. But I think, again, the line has to surely go somewhere halfway through the human being, because we are made in God's image. We are fallen creatures. As Christians, we're also redeemed creatures. And so, but whether we're Christian or not, we remain mixed bag, right? There are some things about us that are still an expression of the image of God in us. There are some things about us that are marred by sin. And so, the line between godly and worldly, between good and bad, between spiritual and unspiritual, runs right through us. And so we need to be careful. We sometimes use the word human to mean bad, but if something is human, or if something is man-made, or something like that, it doesn't yet tell us whether it's good or bad. Okay? If something is human or man-made, it means it's probably a mix of good and bad. And by the way, I wish it was as easy as drawing the line as neatly as that through the human being. But of course, it's a lot more complex and messed up and involved than that. Perhaps a better way to draw that would be through a use of colors, and to say, if made in the image of God was the color red, then every part of us would be a shade of red. And if sin were the color blue, then every part of us would be a shade of blue. So I've basically given you a theory of purple. Do you like it? So we are mixed in every aspect of our being. There's an image of God that's still true, that hasn't gone away, but every part of that image of God is also being damaged, diminished, distorted by sin. And every part of that, again, is part of God's redemption purposes for us. Every part of that is what Jesus is redeeming in us, until one day, in the last part of the story, we are fully restored to everything we're meant to be. We are restored to the fullness of our humanity. And being human is a good thing. Okay? It's an image of God thing. It's how God made us. It's just that human right now is marred by sin. But once our humanity is released again from that, then we are again, in that sense, the full expression of humanity. And human is a good thing. Right. Some pointers. So this is section 2.3 in your notes. So just, I think, by way of summarizing where we've gone to already, we are made as relational and cultural beings. And culture is not the result of the fall, but culture is certainly affected by the fall. Culture is what we make of creation. God cares about all things. He cares about culture. Culture is included in God's plan for the restoration of all things. There will be culture in heaven, and we express our hope of heaven in the way that we live and engage now. So it's a hope of the future, but it already excites us, and it already energizes us, and it already also guides us in the way that we live and engage now. So it matters how we live now and what we do with culture now. Right, that was culture. So now let's talk about what is Christian cultural leadership. If you need a stretch break, give yourself a few moments, and then we dive into the second part. What is Christian cultural leadership? Now, I am aware that this is perhaps an unusual concept, or certainly a concept that isn't talked about that much in church circles. So, for example, if I Google the phrase Christian cultural leadership and I look for South African results, I get exactly, as of today, as I'm speaking, 2 results out of that. And both of them are actually from JBC, are from this course. So it's not a frequently used concept. And yet I think it is something that perhaps under a different name, we all do. Okay? Sometimes we don't notice that we're doing it. We don't always do it well. We don't always do it intentionally, but we do it. And given that we're doing it, we might as well do it well. We might as well do it intentionally. Let's explore it a little bit. So here's an attempt at a definition of Christian cultural leadership. Christian cultural leadership is a Christian effort and ethos for restoration and transformation. So that's the definition. I'm going to unpack every bit of that as we go along. So let's start on the right-hand side, just because I'm using some really big words here. Restoration, transformation. What do I mean? Okay, so by way of answering that, let me try and illustrate this with an analogy. Imagine you have a sick baby now, or a sick young child. Now, do you give this child food or medicine? And I would think that your answer is, well, both. Now, why is your answer both? Because there are actually two different processes that you want to have happen inside of the child. So do you give it food? Do you give it medicine? You give it both. Why? Because on the one hand, you want the child to become well. The child is sick. You want it to become well again. So you want to give it medicine for the healing process. Right. But then also there's a growth process inside the child. You want that child to grow up and to mature. And in order to do that, you give it food. So that is part of the normal, healthy growth process. So do you see the difference? There are these two processes that are happening. And I think it's similar with our approach to culture. We now have the analogy of that. So with restoration, I mean almost like the healing part of our cultural engagement, that there's something about our culture that isn't all well, that is sick and that needs healing. And so part of Christian cultural leadership will be to work towards that healing, towards that restoration. But then also there's the growth part of it, and that I've called transformation. If you want to use a different word, by all means do. So transformation, just a normal growth process within culture. Okay? The story begins in the garden, it ends in the garden city. We make stuff, we create stuff, we cultivate stuff, and that is the transformation part of our Christian cultural leadership. And we would be involved in both those areas. Sometimes, again, it's not neatly separable. Sometimes some of us are more involved in the one than we are in the other. But certainly CCL, Christian cultural leadership, involves both of those. Okay, so that was the right-hand side of this definition. Now let's, there was healing, and there was growth. And in some ways, what we are talking about there is this is the content of what we are doing. This is, the type of things that we're doing when we're being Christian cultural leadership, being Christian cultural leaders. There's also, I think, the part of, or the element of how we do it, and perhaps even of who we are as we are doing this. So that's the left-hand side of the definition, and let me get into those parts of it a little bit more as well. So a Christian effort, you can see what I'm talking about there is that idea of being intentional about it, of actually being conscious of this is something we need to do, and this is something worth doing well. So versus then the ethos, so that is more about who we are, the attitude, the character that we have. Let me go through each one. So the effort, that's what talks about intentionality. This is about seeking to love your neighbor and to do that well. This is about shaping relationships in society in a biblical way. It includes stewardship, including the stewardship of whatever influence we have. Some of us have little, some of us have a lot, but we are all stewards of the influence that we've been given. How are we stewarding that influence? So Christian cultural leadership is also just leading where you are or where you can. You don't need to wait for a big title before you can be a Christian cultural leader. You don't need to wait for some, formal role that is being given to you. Okay? You can lead where you are in the way that you can. Okay? Sometimes that's high impact. Sometimes we can't really see the impact that much. Either way, you are serving God, you are glorifying God, you're being a Christian cultural leader. This is about doing our best to bring goodness to our world, which will probably also include restraining evil in our world. It's living out the gospel. So not just preaching it and proclaiming it, but also living it out in all parts of our lives and in everything that we do. So that was the effort bit, being intentional. Now let's go to the ethos bit, who we are, our attitude, our character. So let's have a look at ethos. So our ethos is one of seeking to serve and glorify God, seeking to follow the example of Jesus, seeking shalom, that beautiful Old Testament concept of the right alignment of everything, of the flourishing of life, of good, healthy, flourishing relationships. Okay, that is what we're after. That is what we want to express. Being salt and light, we've already talked a lot about that. Being relational, because remember, we are made as relational beings in the image of a relational God. It's the healing and the transformation, the growth, embracing responsibility, embracing our moral agency. So again, you can see there's something active about that. It's not just passive watching, cultural commentary. It's a much more hands-on thing. Equipping, empowering, encouraging, enlarging. I'm just trying to play with some words here that all start with the same letter. We are radically cultural and radically countercultural. Okay? Because why? Because we are in the world and not of the world. Remember, it's a both and we need to remember both of those things. And it's in the tension between those two things that we are probably in the right place. So we neither over-adapt nor under-adapt to our culture. Again, I'm referring back to our session on contextualization, if you remember that, where those are the two opposite errors that we could potentially fall into. But remember, if we over-adapt, then probably it's because we don't have gospel confidence. And if we under-adapt, it's probably because we don't have gospel grace. So the true gospel makes us both humble and bold and allows us not to either over or under-adapt. So it's to find that middle line, that higher ground between the two extremes. And another way of saying that, also out of the contextualization session, just by way of revision, is that we both challenge and we complete the narratives and the aspirations of our culture. It's the both and. On the one hand, we challenge it because there are things in it that aren't quite right, but on the other hand, we affirm it and we complete it because there are things in there that in some ways still reflect the image of God in us. Christian cultural leadership focuses on faithfulness above success, or perhaps even above impact. I think that's important. Remember, so please don't say, I can't be a big light, therefore I won't even try. Yeah, so just be faithful in the daily, mundane things. That's a part of what it means to be a Christian cultural leader. People will see that, okay, even if you don't have a big title. You are just merely by the fact that you are being a Christian, you are being different, you are being a leader, you are being an influencer, merely by the fact of who you are. Christian cultural leadership makes no artificial separation between secular and sacred. What if there is no such division? What if God is the God of all things, not just sacred things? So Christian cultural leadership is able to see God's concern, God's lordship over all things, including all things cultural. And another way to express it, and you will remember an earlier session on that, Christian cultural leadership is about engagement. Okay? So it's asking, how do I engage, rather than fight or flight or yield. Sometimes, by exception, I may need to fight or flee or yield, but we always seek to find a better way than that. We seek to find the way of engagement. So there it is, the definition of Christian cultural leadership. As I said, this is a little bit of a theoretical session. We will flesh this out in future sessions, but just stay with me, I think, for the theory bit. We got to start there. We've got to have something on which to build in future sessions. So also just to add in, for clarity, is what CCL is not. So I've tried to say what CCL is. This section is about what it is not, and hopefully that will also be meaningful to you. Okay, so CCL is not an embracing of worldly wisdom or techniques or values or priority. It's not an attempt by Christians to grab power or to use force. It's there are some Christians who feel, yeah, that's what we need to do. You know, we just, I don't know, we need to bring in that Christian president or whatever. We need to grab power. We need to run the show. I think be careful with that, because remember, whether you're Christian or non-Christian, you're a mixed bag. Okay, you are, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, you're affected by sin. So don't be so naive as to think that if Christians run the show, everything's just going to be wonderful. It's not. Look at some of the issues that we find in churches, if you don't believe me. CCL is not a striving for recognition or wealth or status, etc. Okay? It's not about me. It's not about us. It's not passion without substance. Okay? It's not just about, I don't know, having all the fluffy but meaningless things to say. There's substance behind it. It's not an inward-focused Christian subculture. It's very much outward-focused. Okay? It's for the good of the world, not just for the good of the church. It's not darkness detection. I don't know if you remember when we said that in an earlier session as well. Okay, we are called to be light. That is something different than being called to be a darkness detector. I hope you see the difference. Okay? We are called to be light, not darkness detectors. It's also not passive cultural critique from the sidelines. Okay, it's active, it's engaged, it's getting into that arena, it's getting our hands dirty, so to speak. It's not fight, flight, yield. Usually, we try and find the engage route. It's not an attempt to change structures without changing hearts and relationships. Again, that is an error that we might sometimes fall into, that we think, you know, if we just change the system, then everything's going to be fine. But remember, behind every system, behind every structure, are human beings. Behind all of that are human hearts, human relationships. And that's at the core of what needs our attention and what needs redemption, right? CCL is also not placing our hope in an ideology or in societal change. I think that's a different way of saying the same thing. It's not neglecting the gospel or the salvation of individual people. That remains core. All we're saying here is that the core isn't the whole picture. And the whole picture is bigger than the core. It's not focusing only on the here and now. So some people's objection against Christian cultural engagement is, you know, aren't you just here and now focused? You know, shouldn't we be looking at eternity, as if things that we do here and now have no eternal value? But what if they do? What if what we do here matters? And what if the best way we show up in the present moment is that we show up with the hope of the future? And also, I think, with an understanding of the past and of our come from. Okay, whether that's the long distance past, like where God's story begins, or whether that's our more recent past in terms of the history of our country or of our planet. So, no, Christian cultural leadership isn't just focusing on the here and now, although, of course, the only place we can act is now. It's also not the social gospel. The term social gospel is sometimes used as a negative. Okay, it's a bit of a swear word, like social gospel. That means you've lost what the gospel is actually about, because you have reduced the gospel just to being a change of society, and you're forgetting about the redemption of individual hearts. Now, CCL is not that. Okay, so don't fall into that error. It's not just focusing on societal change. It's a whole picture. It's individuals, it's communities, it's systems, it's all of it. So CCL is not an over-realized eschatology. That's a very big phrase, but theologians often use it. The idea is there of almost like expecting heaven on earth, expecting too much of the future in the present. That's what theologians call it, an over-realized eschatology. So CCL isn't that. So we're under no illusion that we think, if we just work hard enough, we're going to create heaven on earth. It's not going to be as easy as that. But certainly, if we really apply ourselves, we will certainly be witnessing to our hope of heaven. We will certainly be expressing something about who God is and what it is that He's doing with His creation. So CCL is not a diminished hope of heaven. On the contrary, it's actually an expression of that hope. I'm hoping that the slide 2 is helpful. And I'm also hoping that by having done all that I've already started to answer the question, why bother with CCL? So if this is what CCL is, why bother with it? And think a little bit what your answer would be before we go through the notes. Why do you think we should bother with Christian cultural leadership? Here are some answers. You may have others. This is not a complete set, all right? So add your own answers in. I'm sure they are good answers. But one answer would certainly, I think, be it's God's concern. It's part of our stewardship. It's a way of loving God and of loving neighbor. It changes ourselves. It changes others. It changes the world. If you remember, I gave 3 good reasons why we should bother with EGW. It's similar with why we should bother with CCL, with Christian cultural leadership. It's for our own personal growth, because Jesus is Lord over all aspects of our lives, not just some aspects. So as we do CCL, we grow more comprehensively as Jesus would like us to grow. And then it's also good for our evangelism, because what we're doing with CCL is we're witnessing through our lives. We're perhaps also creating an environment for evangelism. And then thirdly also is the salt and light thing. We bother with CCL because there's that salt and light effect that we have. It's the impact that we have on community and society. A high engagement level leads to high life change, a low engagement level to low life change. As I said, add your own answers. I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said here. Let me, as we start closing the session, ask you 2 more questions. Here's one. How does our understanding of God's word enable us to lead or be an influence in God's world? Take a moment to think. So, your understanding of God's word, how does that help you to do CCL? Again, You may have other answers. Here are some possible answers. This is quite probably not an exhaustive list, but I think certainly of God's big story, because remember God's big storyline: creation, fall, redemption, eternity, is the story of God redeeming and renewing, of God reversing the effects of the fall, of God rescuing us, of God at work, of God being active and alive and caring for all of his creation and everything in it. That's the story. So if that is the story that we're living in, then surely CCL makes a lot of sense. It actually becomes part of our mission as actors in God's story. So similar point, think of God's purposes, okay? His purposes of redeeming, of renewing, of restoring shalom, of restoring the image of God in us. If that is what God's purpose is, then surely CCL makes a lot of sense and helps us to do CCL. In some ways, if we look at some of the Bible characters and some of the stories that we have, in some ways CCL is about being, for example, the Josephs or the Daniels or the Esthers or the Nehemiahs of our time. Okay, now we're not living their lives, we're somewhere else in the story. But think of what some of these people did. Okay, so some of them, actually I think all four that are mentioned there, were actually in the service of a government or of an authority that wasn't Christian, that was pagan, right? And yet these people all applied themselves in service of those kingdoms. Okay, so Joseph essentially kind of like a prime minister role in the service of Pharaoh, in the service of Egypt. Daniel, also some, certainly ministerial type of role in Babylon. Esther, she was the queen, and Nehemiah also was the cupbearer to the king. And these people applied themselves, and some of them had to think through some difficult issues. Some of them faced troubles as the result of making godly decisions. They had very different experiences as well, right? So Nehemiah, as far as we know, didn't experience the type of troubles that, for example, Joseph or Daniel would have experienced. So, there's no blueprint, there's no one way of doing that. But what if CCL is about being that type of an influence? Or the type of influence of some of the prophets. And remember also, the prophets had very, very different experiences. I think of Jeremiah, who seemed to have just, must have had the feeling of preaching against a brick wall for most of his life because people weren't listening. And yet he was still speaking truth. He was being faithful to God in what he was doing, even though he didn't see the immediate result and the immediate impact of what he was doing. He was doing a good thing. He was being faithful to God. He was doing CCL in a way. Or I'm just picking up some other people who perhaps aren't the big names. It's also being the Ruths or the Boazes or the Jobs of our time. So Ruth, not a very influential person, but her story is told in the Bible as one who is faithful, as one who served God. Boaz, okay, he was a landowner. He was perhaps in a little bit of a different situation. But again, he was just, one of many farmers at the time. But he was doing a good thing. He was making good decisions. He was making godly actions. He was being a cultural leader. And I'm throwing in Job just because, Job's experience is very different again, right? There's a lot of suffering in Job's experience, and we just need to, I think, have our radar open for that as well, acknowledge that as well, that perhaps part of our Christian cultural leadership may involve some not nice episodes of suffering. We need to be real about that, etc. And then Jesus speaks on a wide range of topics. So Jesus would talk about, think about that. Jesus doesn't only talk about heaven, right? He doesn't only talk about, I don't know, worship songs or something like that. Okay? Jesus talks on so many things that are very much culture things. He talks about money and sex and power. He talks about taxes. He talks about authorities. He talks about work. He talks about rest. He talks about what we value. He talks about identity. He talks about purpose, about how we treat things, how we treat each other. He talks about so many things that are in the realm of culture. And so as we listen to Jesus on these things, hopefully we do become better equipped for our Christian cultural leadership. And the New Testament also speaks about us as being God's ambassadors, of being God's representatives. And again, I think that is a deeply CCL type of a concept, etc. Again, you may have other answers. This is my attempt at them. So CCL, just to start wrapping it up, really can happen everywhere, right? It's in all situations, we can do CCL, okay? Whether it's with family or friends, the conversations that we have, or whatever we're doing in our neighborhood or community or church or work or school or campus. Can happen in organizations, it can happen in initiatives or projects, in any human interactions that we have. We can be Christian cultural leaders. And then just to close and perhaps leave that a little bit open-ended for further thought, here's your bonus question. Is there a Christian culture? And this is a little bit of a tricky question, right? And I'm stirring a little bit by asking the question, but I think it's an important one to ask. So is there such a thing as Christian culture? And is that what we should be trying to achieve? Now, by way of a partial answer to that, let me give you a quote that I had from the Christian rapper NF. He was once talked of being a Christian rapper. So there was somebody in an interview referred to him as being a Christian rapper. And you can see NF wasn't quite happy with the concept. And the way he answered that is he said, if you're a Christian and you're a plumber, are you a Christian plumber? Do you see the problem with that? Do you see the complexity of it? So I think we need to be careful of using Christian as an adjective. Okay, so yes, I can be a Christian. Yes, I can be a plumber. But what is a Christian plumber? So be careful of using Christian as an adjective. What is, in this analogy, a Christian plumber, right? Is it somebody who only does plumbing for churches? Is it when he does plumbing, does holy water flow through his pipes? Does he put, I don't know, little Bible verses on his taps, like something about springs of living water or something like that? Do you see the problem? There's really a problem when we're trying to start using Christian as an adjective. So I'm not sure whether it's actually meaningful to talk about something like Christian culture. I mean, I understand what it is that we're trying to do, but I don't actually think we're doing Christian culture as much as maybe we're doing church culture. So I can see how church has culture and different churches have different cultures, but be careful before you call that Christian culture. I don't think our aim should be to create Christian culture or a Christian subculture, because to do that, to create our own little Christian bubble, can you see that's not really the engage option? That's more the flight option, the running away option. I think that there should be Christians in all cultures and seeking to bring their cultures more into alignment with God's character and purposes. So in each culture, there will be some things that are towards God, or in line with God, and some things that are working again or trying to set themselves up against God. But that'll be in every culture, and there'll be Christians in every culture. And so I don't think we should be also trying to almost like to create that one singular Christian culture. I think cultural diversity is a beautiful thing. We should value that. We should celebrate that. We should preserve that. And as Christians, be active in every culture. So you in yours, I in mine. Everyone in their culture, either culture of origin or culture of mission, the culture that Jesus sends us into to serve. And we should seek to engage that culture and be Christian cultural leaders in those contexts. I hope I'm making sense. I think I'm done. Further reading, you can see in your handout that there are further pages. So I've given you some excerpts from various people, perhaps for further reading, for further engaging with, see what you think of that. I've also given you some books, some of which I think should be in the JBC library, not that you have access to that right now, but hopefully soon we will have access to that again. God bless you.